So before we get started, who here is already using Constraint Layout in production? A third of the room. OK, so 2/3 of you, have you explored Constraint Layout? Who's not looked at Constraint Layout before? No one. OK. Three. I saw 3 hands come up. OK. So this talk, what I'm going to talk about is Constraint Layout that we've introduced as one of the layouts for Android. I'm going to start with the basics. I'm going to cover the features that came in Constraint Layout 1, Constraint Layout 1.1, and kind of give a survey of what you can use Constraint Layout to build. And then I'm going to move on and talk about some of the new features that are coming out in Constraint Layout 2.0. One of the big ones that we'll talk about is MotionLayout. So to get started, I think we should talk about what are constraints. So when you add a view to the layout in Constraint Layout, you get these 4 handles. You get the handle on the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And if you drag one of those handles, or you select over on the right, you can create a constraint for this view. So before I did that, this view was unconstrained. If I ran this app in production, that view would show up somewhere on the screen, but it's probably not where I expected it to go. So here I've added a constraint. It's 30 dp. And so that's telling the Constraint Layout editor that this view should be constrained to be 30 dp from the top. I can do the same thing on the left. And these 2 constraints together fully position that view. So before I did that, either both sides were unconstrained, or just the left side and right side were unconstrained, and Constraint Layout didn't know where to lay out this view. And of course, I can change the padding that I have on this view. I can change it to 50, or interestingly, I can change it to 0. And I'm going to change the left padding to 0 as well. And then I'm going to do something where I add a 0 on the right as well. And when I do that, Constraint Layout's actually going to center the view. And this is something when designing views using Constraint Layout, you're going to use this trick all the time. If you constrain the left and the right to either things that are far away or things that are close together, it's always going to try to center the view around what you've constrained it to. Now, if I want to center this vertically, I have a 0 dp constraint on top. And now I'm going to go ahead and put a 0 dp constraint on bottom. And that's going to go ahead and center this view all the way in the view hierarchy. So that's all constraints are. It's a source with the top, the left, the right, or the bottom, and a destination. Here, we're only constraining to the edges of the view hierarchy. And constraints have one more feature. Just looking at one view, what can we do with one view in Constraint Layout? Constraints have this concept called bias. So this is, if you've used linear layout, this is probably very similar to what you're familiar with. A bias controls, for a constraint that has equal margins on the top and the bottom, where does it get laid out when it does that centering? So by default, it starts, of course, at 50%, which is right in the middle. But I can change that. I can set that to 25. And that's going to make it be biased when it does that centering effect. I can change it, of course, to 75. It biases towards the bottom. And there's one for the horizontal bias as well. So combining these, I can constrain a view to be anywhere on the screen I would like it to be. And this is kind of, I don't know, interesting. But so far, we've only looked at one view. So before we move on, let's talk a little bit about what we can do with Constraint Layout. So if you haven't used Constraint Layout before, I think we all know wrap content, right? Wrap content's been around since the beginning of Android. It says this view should expand to fill its content. Constraint Layout also lets you set fixed dimensions, right? So here, we're updating the UI in the visual editor, and we're setting it to 100 dp, and that's represented visually over on the right. Constraint Layout has one other thing, which is kind of similar to match parent. So if you use match parent in frame layout, linear layout, it means expand to fill the parent, right? Constraint Layout, we don't use match parent. Instead, we use this thing called match constraint. And what match constraint means is, well, in this case, it actually means the same thing as match parent, because it says, go ahead and expand to fill what's allowed by my constraints. When I have constraints that maybe aren't the full screen, it's going to expand to fill whatever the constraints allow as well. And we'll see an example of that in just a minute. Now, I just want to point out right now, if you haven't used Constraint Layout before, you should just basically never use match parent with Constraint Layout. It's always the correct choice to use match constraint. Now, let's go ahead and switch this back to wrap content and move on and add. Oh, let me see what's going on. And let's add another view. So I'm going to go ahead and add an image. And I'm going to go ahead and add a constraint from that image to the view that I've added. And so this is something that's interesting with Constraint Layout. It looks kind of similar to maybe what you've done with relative layout previously. So this is saying this image view should be constrained to be 20 dp above that text view. But right now, I haven't constrained the left or the right of this image view at all. So the image view is allowed to just kind of float around the screen, left or right, wherever it wants to go. So let's add constraints to the right edge. So we can take the right edge of this image view, and we can constrain that to the right edge of this text box. So constraint end to constraint end. I can do the same thing over on the start. And when I do that, it's going to go ahead and center that image view. So here, instead of centering on the entire screen, I'm centering on the constraints that are defined by another view. So if I switch this view to use match constraints, the UI changes over in the visual editor. And I get this weird triangle over on the configuration square. And if I click that triangle, I get this thing. This only applies really to certain views. But if I click that, I get an aspect ratio. By default, I'm going to go ahead and set that to 1.1, or 1 to 1. This is saying that the width and the height should be the same. And the way this works is because the width is match constraint, I'm saying that the constraint of this view is that it has the aspect ratio of 1 to 1. And now the width can't expand when the height is set to, let's say it's 120 dp. And of course, I can change that aspect ratio. I can set that to 2 to 1. And it's going to resize my width in order to maintain that aspect ratio. So this is fantastic. I mean, I get a lot of designs from designers where it's go ahead and make this image have this aspect ratio. And previously, that was somewhat difficult to do in the framework. I can make it 16 by 9. But when I make it 3 to 1, this is more interesting, right? So here I'm saying constrain to the right, constrain to the left, and also try to make it an aspect ratio of 3 to 1. And 3 to 1 is larger than the available space by the constraint. So which one of these wins? And the answer is the left and the right constraints win. If I want to allow it to be 3 to 1, I can change the height to be match constraint as well. And then it resizes the height and the width to maintain that aspect ratio. So let's move on to a substantially more, I think, complex example, and also a very real-world example. So I got this login form from a designer, and I just want to say this is a talk about constraint layout, not a talk about designing login forms. So there's many problems with this login form, but we're going to talk about the constraint layout part of it. So this looks like it's centered in the middle. It's also centered vertically as well. It looks like that login button might be constrained to the right of the password field. And then there's a couple other things going on. So let's try to build this in Constraint Layout. We're just going to wire all these views up and see what's going on. Now, before we do that, how should I align email and the hint text, right? So I have me@gmail.com. And those are both obviously different size fonts. So I don't want to just set the views to be at the same bottom. So when we look at fonts, we have these concepts of font metrics. So there's the baseline, there's the ascender line, there's the descender line. There's all these different lines that exist if you go look at a topography book. And the one that really matters is the baseline. The baseline of a font is the line that almost everything sits on. There's a couple things in English text like this, like Y, that goes below that baseline. But almost everything hangs out on the baseline. And when I have another piece of text that's a different font, what I can do is lay it out with the same baseline. And when I design it that way, it looks visually appealing to your eye, and it looks like you've created a nice, well put together design. So going back to this view, so how do I align these by baseline? So in Constraint Layout, when I select a text view, this UI control shows up. It looks exactly like this. So you get a little AB and a little chev that's pointing up. And when you click that, it adds my favorite UI control in all of Android Studio. I call it the flashing green orb of baseline. It literally flashes and it's green, and I'm not really sure what UX designer was involved in making that, but it's beautiful. It's a beautiful UI control. So when you do that, you can go ahead and do the same thing over on the email address. And then we can create a constraint from the baseline of the email address to the baseline of the email text field. And this is pretty much always what you want to do when you're laying multiple lines of text out horizontally. You want to do this in Constraint Layout. You also want to do this with other layouts. And Constraint Layout makes it really easy with the visual editor. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing for the password field. And then we'll do the new account and login. And this is a little bit interesting. The other ones, we've constrained the baseline from the right to the left. But here, we're going to constrain the right side of the login to the right side of the password. So we'll actually want to do that the other way, right? Because we want new account to follow the baseline of login. So let's go ahead and constrain login. So I already mentioned we're going to go ahead and constrain that right side. And then all we have to do is set a constraint between the password field and login. And when we do that, we just create that constraint, and the new account will follow the position of login. And this is kind of the key to figuring out how to design with Constraint Layout, is you kind of build these hierarchies of views without actually adding a hierarchy. So next, we want to vertically center this view. So we have email and password and these login buttons. And when I look at this, the designer wants me to vertically center the email and the password fields. So let's try to do that with Constraint Layout. So we've already learned so far, like if we want to center something, just put a constraint on both sides, and it's going to go ahead and it's always going to center it. So let's figure out how to do that. So first, we'll create a constraint up from email, and that's going to shift everything up. Then we're going to put a constraint down from password, and that's going to shift half of the views down. But we have to constrain between these two, because that's fundamentally what we wanted to do. We want these to be a fixed amount away from each other. So we make a constraint from password to email. That pulls everything back up. And then this is kind of surprising. We make a constraint from email down to password. And that causes it to center. So what we've done here is we've created kind of a recursive structure here between email and password. And when we do that in Constraint Layout, it's called a chain. Now, it's kind of tedious to wire up all of those constraints by hand. So Constraint Layout has a helper. So you can just select these two, or you can just right-click anywhere on your view and use center vertically. And when you do that, it's going to go ahead and create all of the constraints we just created by hand. So when I have a chain, there's basically 3 different ways to configure a chain. So you can spread the views, which looks similar to like a linear layout, right? So the views are equally spaced away from each other. You can spread inside, which places the first and last view on the edges. And then you can do packed, where everything goes in towards the center. And what we really wanted for this one, we want a chain that has the configuration of packed. And from my experience, that's the typical one. That's the one I usually reach for. And the other two are useful in other situations. So when we look at this design, the other thing that's going on with it is there's this very strong vertical line going down the middle. The email and password are right justified on it, and the email address and password field are left justified on it. And so how are we going to do that in Constraint Layout? What we can do is we can use helpers and then add vertical guideline. So add vertical guideline. A guideline basically is just another, you can think of it as another edge of the screen, right? So we have a left side of the screen, a right side of the screen, and now I've added one in the middle of the screen. It's called a guideline. And I can position that. I can move that around. I can just set literally the percentage of the screen I'd like this guideline to be at. And then all I do is take my email and password fields and constrain that to this guideline. And it acts as the edge of the screen. Similarly, I constrain the other views as well. Now, if I move this guideline around, just to kind of really drive home like that everything's anchored on this guideline, the views will just follow, and everything is actually constrained off of this guideline. And we move it back and back. Now I have another view that comes from a different designer on my team. So he likes left justified stuff. So he has an email and a password that's left justified, and then there's some space, and then there's an email and a password field. And this is a pretty common view to have to try to lay out. So let's try to do this in Constraint Layout. Now, it's pretty easy, right? You just imagine I'm just going to lay out email and password to the left, and then I'm going to email my actual email address and my actual password to that. But let's go ahead and then translate this to German and see what happens. This is I think, maybe not unexpected. Like, every time I've gotten a string back for German, it's like twice as long as the English version of the string. But what ends up happening is email address overflows into the email, and the new account create is just way off the screen. So what happened here? So let's say in English, I set up my constraints. So password's the longest field between email and password. So I would go ahead and make a constraint from password to password, and then another constraint on the left side between my actual email address and my actual password. And this works fine as long as password is the longest string. But that's not something that's universally true. Like, password is sometimes not the longest string of these two. And then when we go over to German, password is no longer the longest string of these two, and we get this overflow behavior. So how do we fix this? So there's another helper that we can use. So we use helpers, and then we can add a barrier. So what a barrier is it's a barrier that says, like, all of the views inside this barrier have to be on one side or the other of this barrier. And by default, it's just kind of hanging out somewhere in my view. And then I open the view hierarchy, and I can select the email and password field views, and then drag those down and make them children of the barrier. And when I start out, it's going to put the barrier on the left side, which is not actually what I wanted. So I go back over to the attribute editor, and I can set the barrier direction. The two options, start and end. Let's move it over to the end, which will always position it at the end of these text views. So now I just take my email address and my password field, and I constrain these to the barrier instead of any of the individual text views. And when I translate to German, the barrier is going to shift based on the length of the longest text view, and all of the rest of the layout's going to follow. So this covers all of the features that shipped in Constraint Layout 1.0, Constraint Layout 1.1. So this is everything that you need to know. If you've already been using Constraint Layout, this part was probably a recap. If you're new to Constraint Layout, this was hopefully educational. So now I want to talk about the features that come up with 2.0. In particular, I want to talk about MotionLayout. So MotionLayout is a pretty exciting new feature. So who here has made a collapsible header? Who here enjoyed making a collapsible header? One person did. OK, cool. So collapsible headers, I mean, I made one. I spent a week on it. It was actually, like, kind of hard to move a couple views around with collapsible header. Constraint Layout, this is all done with MotionLayout, which is a new feature that's coming out with Constraint Layout 2.0. So it's based on all of those things we just talked about, right? So we still have constraints, we have guidelines, we have barriers, but we're now able to create animations by using those constraints and changing them over time. This is a really cool example. Chris Baines put this together. He published it on Twitter, and there's the sample code's up, so you can go take a look at it. It's a little bit more complex than the example I'm going to work in this talk, but you can see the basic ideas. Like, everything here is just chains and constraints, and we're just moving this view behind the other one by changing the y coordinate, and we're just, hiding some other views with some alpha stuff. So there's nothing like too crazy going on here, and you can see how you can build all of these different steps with Constraint Layout. So what kind of things can you build with MotionLayout? So you can build collapsible headers, and I think for me, that's very exciting. I'm very excited about collapsible headers. You can build state feedback. So if you go online to offline and you want to animate between those two states, it's very, very easy to do that with MotionLayout. You can build transitions between a couple different states with MotionLayout. And literally every animation I've done in this presentation could be implemented in MotionLayout relatively easy. So when we first dive into MotionLayout, I think it's really important to think about what is an animation, like what is motion. And when we take an animation apart, every single animation consists of a start. There's some starting state where the screen is in a state, and then there's some ending state, and the screen's in another state. And all animations are comprised of a start and an end position. So if we look at this like graphically, here's my start position. And let's imagine this is done in Constraint Layout. I've constrained this to the top and the left. And here's an end position. I've constrained it to the bottom and the right. Now, an animation, so I've defined two states now. An animation consists of everything that happens to move from that start state to that end state. And then when I run it, it just looks like that, right? So that's a linear animation that goes straight from that start state to that end state. And motion layout is based fundamentally on that idea, right? You define the start state, you define the end state, and then in between, motion layout figures out how to animate your views between those two states. So motion layout is a subclass of constraint layout. And it has two new things that you have to think about. It has a motion scene, which is a separate XML file. So you have now a motion layout XML file and then a motion scene XML file. And then in that motion scene, you have start and end. A start and end is defined in terms of constraint sets, which are a little bit different than what we've been doing so far. So when we had this design here, so we've gone and defined an entire layout plus the constraint set for laying out something on the screen. So this contains, obviously, the views, as well as all of the constraints on those views. And put that together, Constraint Layout's able to turn that into where the views should end up on the screen. Constraint set is really just all of the constraints minus the views. And so like that's the key to understanding what a constraint set is. It says view with this ID is constrained to view with that ID. And motion layout is all about animating constraint sets. So we make an animation like that. So let's look at a very simple example. So here's an animation that 3, 2, 1 that is not playing. OK, well, I'm going to describe the animation, then we're going to go through code. So this has, oh, did it? OK, awesome, awesome. You saw the animation? All right, well, I haven't seen the animation yet, so I'm trusting you. So yeah, so there's a title on the top, there's a subtitle, and there's some stuff on the bottom. And graphically, it looks a bit like this. So in motion layout, or in constraint layout, if I wanted to lay this out, at the end state, it's going to look like this, right? I have a title, there's a subtitle, it's constrained off the title. And then down at the bottom, I have the detail, the lorem ipsum text at the bottom. And then the image view is constrained off of that bottom view as well. So in order to make a motion scene, I need to define both a start and an end, right? So I've shown you how to build the end. So the start is actually fairly simple, right? So all I'm going to do is move that title off the screen. It's going to go, I'm going to constrain the right side of the title, or the end of the title, to the left side, or the start of the screen. And what this says is I'd like this view to be positioned off the screen over on the left side out in the place that I'm not displaying anywhere. And Constraint Layout's totally happy with that. It's going to lay everything out with that view off the screen. And similarly, I'm going to do the exact same thing with that, the lorem ipsum on the bottom, the description on the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and make a constraint from the bottom view to the bottom of the screen. And then when I make a motion layout file, what I'm going to do is, I'm not sure if you can read that. So if I make a motion layout file, I'm going to go ahead and set a layout description, and I'm going to pass it a space scene. And so that's that motion scene we talked about earlier. And then the rest of the motion layout file looks very similar to what we did with the constraint layout file, with one big difference. In a motion layout file, I'm just going to define the layouts, or I'm going to put the views into the file. So I'm going to say, make a text view, make an image view. And I'm not going to tell motion layout where to position those views. Then over in my motion scenes, this is a separate XML file, I'm going to create 2 constraint sets. One of them, the start constraint set, and one of them, the end constraint set. And then in the start constraint set, I just go ahead and say, this is the constraint set start. And it consists of a whole bunch of different constraints, right? So I've just shown one here. They're fairly verbose, and it would take multiple slides to go through the whole thing. But I'm going to go ahead and make one constraint here. So I'm going to constrain that title view. And here in the constraint set, I'm going to go ahead and specify the width and the height, as well as the padding for this view. And then I'm going to say what I'm supposed to constrain it by. And here I'm trying to push it off the screen, so I'm going to constrain the end to the start of the parent. Right, and so this is how I push that title off the screen. And I'm going to repeat this constraint for every other view that I'm trying to constrain in my view hierarchy. Then I'm going to go ahead and define the end constraint, and let's look at that exact same constraint. So here I'm defining the end constraint, and it's for the title as well. And the only difference between this and the other constraint is that I'm going to constrain the start to the start of the parent, right? I bring the title onto the screen. And then when I do that, I mean, I've had to add, oh, there we go. I've had to add a whole bunch of all of the other constraints as well. The animation will just play. So you can see it's a nice, easy way to kind of decouple and like to declaratively define a fairly complex animation. And so that's like the key to understanding motion layout, really, is all motion starts, it has a start and it has an end position. And then in between, motion layout will figure out how to draw the animation for you and move those views around, no matter how many views you have to move. If you'd like to learn more, John Hofford and Nicholas Rode have written a great blog post series that introduce this. They go into like substantially more depth about building certain idioms in there. It's a great way to get started with this. The other thing that I would recommend is taking a look at the sample that Chris Baines put together. So he published the code for this, and it's pretty easy to see how you do this. And he did a little bit more than I did. So he introduced some keyframes in the middle there that allow for that moving the title behind. And then, of course, follow Android Dev on Twitter, because this is going to be stable, and we're going to tweet about it all the time once that happens. And if you want to play with this today, if you want to go try it out in your own code, go ahead and get the Constraint Layout Alpha 2, because it's been shipped. It was in Alpha 1. We made some improvements in Alpha 2 as well. So you can try building your own motion layout things today and give us feedback about how you'd like to see the library improved before it hits stable. All right. That's everything I had. So let's go ahead and do Q&A.